The hours before sleep are a kind of waiting, and in that waiting there is permission to let the world grow soft and distant. You are not required to follow a story or hold a thought. You are only asked to rest, to let the weight of the day drift upward and away, like smoke finding a crack in the ceiling. So now, if it feels right, you might allow yourself to settle a little deeper. And if this voice becomes a part of your quiet, you are welcome to let your attention float. Should you wish to hear more of these long, slow nights again, a quiet subscription or a gentle like would be a simple way to remember this place. To understand the life of a medieval peasant is to understand darkness first, because darkness was the beginning of nearly everything. Not the darkness of a room with the lights turned off, but the heavy, absolute dark of a world without electricity, without street lamps, without the faint orange glow of a distant town on the horizon. When the sun went down behind the trees or the low hills of a lord's land, the night was not a time of rest for the peasant but a long, unbroken stretch of blindness broken only by the occasional ember in the central hearth. That hearth was the heart of the house, but the house itself was small, usually a single room made of wattle and daub, a mixture of wet soil, clay, straw, and animal dung pressed between wooden stakes. The walls breathed with the weather, letting in the cold air in winter and the smell of damp earth after rain. The floor was packed dirt, hard and uneven, scattered with rushes that were changed only a few times a year, so the lower layers rotted slowly, releasing a sour, vegetal smell that mixed with smoke and old cooking fat. The peasant family slept together in that one room, often on a simple bed frame of wood with ropes pulled tight across it, or on a pile of straw shoved into a corner. There was no privacy, not in the way modern people understand it. Children, parents, sometimes a grandparent, all lying close for warmth, their breath fogging in the cold months. They slept in their clothes, woolen tunics, and linen undergarments, because removing them meant exposing skin to the air, and the air had no mercy. Sleep came in segments, not the single long block of the modern night. They would sleep for a few hours, wake in the deep dark, lie there listening to the animals rustling in the attached byre, then sleep again until the first gray light touched the single shuttered window. That waking in the middle was not considered strange. It was a time for quiet talk, for turning over, for a sip of small beer or water from the wooden cup kept by the bed. Then the second sleep, heavier sometimes, filled with dreams of harvest or hunger, until the cock crowed and the world demanded attention again. The sound that broke the morning was not an alarm but a collection of small violences. The cock, yes, but also the creak of a neighbor's door, the thud of an axe splitting kindling, the low moan of a cow whose udder was full and painful. The peasant rose not with energy but with resignation, the body stiff from the hard surface and the cold. There was no stretching for pleasure. Stretching was a necessity, a way to make the joints work again. The hearth had been banked overnight, coals hidden under ash, and the first task of the day was to blow on those coals until a flame returned. This took patience, sometimes many minutes of kneeling on the dirt floor, cheeks hollowed, breath warm and steady, until a thread of smoke became a tongue of fire, then dry straw, then twigs, then a log. The fire was never allowed to die completely if the family was wise. Relighting a dead hearth meant borrowing a coal from a neighbor or using a flint and steel, which produced a shower of sparks that often failed to catch. So the coals lived just barely through the night. Breakfast was not a meal in the modern sense. It was a piece of dark bread, maybe a bit of cheese if the family kept a goat or a cow, maybe a thin porridge of barley or oats cooked in the same pot that had held the evening meal. The bread was coarse, so coarse that it wore down teeth over a lifetime. It contained not just ground grain but bits of husk, sometimes small stones from the mill, sometimes a stray kernel of rye that had grown a dark fungus called ergot. That fungus could cause hallucinations and burning pains in the limbs, but the peasants did not know this. They only knew that some years the bread tasted bitter and some years people's fingers turned black and fell off. They called it Saint Anthony's fire, and they prayed to the saint for relief. But the prayers did not change the grain. After this small eating, the peasant went to work. The majority of medieval peasants were not slaves, but they were not free either. They were serfs, bound to the land of a lord, and they owed him a portion of their labor and a portion of their harvest. On some days, the peasant worked the lord's domain, the land that belonged directly to the noble, planting his wheat, weeding his rows, harvesting his oats before touching their own small strips of land. On other days, they worked their own holding, a few acres divided into long, narrow strips scattered across the common fields. There were no fences around these strips, only unmarked boundaries of grass or a single stone. Everyone knew where their land began and ended, not because of signs but because of habit, memory, and the quiet threat of a fine if they took a single furrow from a neighbor. The tools were simple and exhausting to use. The plow was a heavy wooden blade tipped with iron, pulled by an ox if the family was fortunate enough to own one, or by the peasant's own shoulders if they were not. Oxen were slow, maddeningly slow, but they were strong, and they ate only grass and straw, which cost nothing but the labor to cut it. The plow did not turn the soil completely. It scratched a furrow, and the peasant walked behind it for hours, the mud clinging to bare feet or to leather shoes that were little more than a sole tied with thongs. The sun moved across the sky, indifferent to the ache in the lower back, the raw skin on the palms where the plow handle rubbed, the flies that gathered around the eyes and the mouth. There was no talking while plowing. The work required a kind of dull concentration, the mind emptying into the rhythm of the ox's steps, the creak of the wood, the soft parting of the earth. By mid-morning, the sun would be high enough to cast a short shadow, and the peasant would stop briefly, not for a break in the modern sense, but to drink from a leather flask filled with water or weak ale. Ale was safer than water because the boiling in its production killed some of the bacteria that lived in streams and wells. The water itself was often cloudy, tasting of minerals and, in lowland areas, of the marshes that surrounded the village. They did not know about germs, but they knew that water from certain wells made the stomach cramp and the bowels run, while ale did not. So even children drank ale, a thin, low-alcohol version called small beer, from the time they could hold a cup. The fields were not quiet. The air carried the sounds of other peasants working their own strips, the thud of a hoe breaking clods of earth, the distant shout of a child chasing a crow from the newly sown grain. The birds were constant enemies. They descended on the fields in great clouds, black against the green, and the peasants had to chase them away with sticks and stones and shouts. Sometimes a boy or a girl was given the task of watching the field all day, sitting on a low stool or a stone, a sling in hand, throwing pebbles at any bird that landed. The child's back would be sunburned, their throat dry, their eyes tired from staring at the same patch of earth for hours. But they did not complain, not out loud, because complaining changed nothing. The soil itself was a presence. It got under the fingernails, into the cracks in the hands, into the hair and the ears. It had a smell that changed with the season, wet and mineral in the spring after the thaw, dry and dusty in the summer, cold and bitter in the autumn when the last roots were pulled from the ground. The peasants' clothes were stiff with it, the wool absorbing the dirt until the original color was a memory. Washing clothes was rare, because soap was made from animal fat and wood ash, a caustic, greasy substance that required labor to produce and left the fabric rough. So the same tunic was worn for weeks, months sometimes, until it began to fall apart or until the smell became so strong that even the other peasants, who were not sensitive to odors, noticed it. Around midday the work did not stop, but it changed. The peasant might leave the plow to gather firewood from the edge of the forest, or to repair a broken fence, or to take the ox to a small stream for water. The meal at midday was the main meal, but it was still simple. A bowl of pottage, which was a thick stew of whatever vegetables were in season, sometimes with a bit of bacon or salted fish if the family had managed to preserve some from the previous winter. The pottage was cooked in a large iron pot that hung over the hearth, and it simmered for hours, the flavors blending into a single brown or green mass. It was eaten with a spoon of carved wood, from a bowl of wood or coarse pottery. There were no forks. The peasant used bread as a kind of edible plate, scooping up the pottage and then eating the bread, which had softened into a paste. The meal was taken either in the house or, if the weather was fine, on the edge of the field, sitting on the ground with the bowl balanced on the knees. There was no table in most peasant houses, only a board laid across two trestles for certain occasions. For daily meals, the family gathered around the hearth, sitting on benches or chests or simply on the dirt floor. They ate in silence more often than not, because they were tired, because there was nothing new to say, because the work of the afternoon still lay ahead. Sometimes the father would say a short prayer in Latin that he did not fully understand, asking God to bless the food and protect the family from hunger. But hunger was always there, a quiet presence at the edge of every meal. After eating, there was no rest. The peasant returned to the field or to the Lord's land. In the afternoon, the light changed, becoming longer and more golden, and the shadows of the trees stretched across the furrows. The work became harder in some ways because the body was tired and the sun was at its warmest. Sweat ran down the face, stinging the eyes, and the peasant wiped it away with the back of a hand that was already filthy. There was no sunscreen, no hat beyond a simple hood of linen, and the skin burned and peeled and burned again over the years, becoming leathery and lined long before old age. A peasant of 30 might look 60 to a modern eye, the teeth worn down or missing, the spine curved from carrying heavy loads, the hands knotted with arthritis. The village itself was small, rarely more than a few dozen families living in houses clustered around a green or along a single muddy lane. The church was the largest building, made of stone if the village was prosperous, or of wood if it was poor. The priest lived among the peasants, not much better off than they were, and he worked the land as well when he was not saying Mass or hearing confessions. The church bell marked the hours, not in a precise way but in a loose, seasonal rhythm. The bell for the Angelus at dawn, noon, and dusk, a sound that traveled across the fields and called the peasants to pause and pray. That pause was the only official rest of the day. A few moments of standing still, head bowed, hands clasped, while the bell's vibration faded into the air. Then the work resumed. As the afternoon wore on, the peasant's mind would sometimes wander to the future, but not in a hopeful way. The future was the same as the past, a repeating cycle of plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, threshing, and grinding. There was no concept of progress, no belief that next year would be better than this year, because next year might bring hail that flattened the grain, or a flood that rotted the roots, or a dry spell that turned the fields to dust, or a lord who raised the rent, or a war that brought soldiers who took the livestock and burned the barns. The only hope was survival, and survival was not guaranteed. In bad years, the peasants ate the seed grain meant for the next planting, which meant the next year would be even worse. In the worst years, they ate bark and grass and the leather of their own shoes, and some of them died, and the dead were buried in shallow graves without a priest if the priest had died too. The evening came slowly, the sky turning from pale blue to the color of bruised plums, then to a deep, velvety black. The peasant left the field when the light became too poor to see the weeds or the ripe ears of grain. There was no artificial light to extend the day, so the day ended when the sun ended. The walk back to the village was quiet, the path familiar in every season, every mud puddle and every protruding root known by feel through the soles of the feet. The other peasants walked in the same direction, a silent line of bent figures, their tools over their shoulders, their animals following behind them. The evening meal was similar to the midday meal, often the same pottage reheated with a fresh piece of bread. Sometimes there was an egg, if the hens had been laying, or a handful of nuts gathered from the forest, or a small piece of cheese that had been pressed and salted to preserve it. The family sat together again, and the fire was built up to provide light and warmth. The flames cast moving shadows on the walls, making the small room feel larger and smaller at the same time. The children, if they were young, might fall asleep where they sat, their heads dropping onto their mothers' laps. The adults talked a little about the weather, about a neighbor who was sick, about the price of a pig at the last market, about a traveler who had passed through and brought news from the next valley. But the news was always the same. Someone had died, someone had been born, the Lord's bailiff was demanding extra eggs, the miller had raised his fee for grinding grain. The miller was a figure of suspicion. Every village had a mill, usually owned by the Lord, and the peasants were required to bring their grain there to be ground into flour. The miller took a portion of the flour as his fee, and everyone believed he took more than he should. There were stories of millers hiding a small hole in the hopper so that a little extra grain fell into a secret bag, or of millers keeping the best flour for themselves and giving the peasants the coarse, gritty remains. The peasants hated the miller and needed him at the same time, because grinding grain by hand with a quern was slow, exhausting work that could take hours and produce only a small amount of flour. So they brought their grain to the mill, paid the fee, and complained in whispers after dark. After the meal, there might be a small amount of work done by firelight. The women would spin wool into thread using a drop spindle, a simple stick with a weight at the bottom that twisted the fibers as it fell. The spindle turned slowly, hypnotically, the thread wrapping around it in a thin, even line. The men might mend a tool, sharpen a blade, or weave thin branches into a basket. The children, if they were still awake, might be given the task of shelling beans or picking the stones out of the grain. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney, which was often just a hole in the roof covered by a wooden shutter. The smoke filled the room before it found its way out, and the peasants' eyes were always slightly red, their lungs always slightly raw. There was no reading because most peasants could not read. There were no books in the house, no paper, no pen. The only writing they ever saw was the priest's missal or the Lord's tallies scratched onto a wooden stick. Stories were spoken, not written, passed down through generations in the form of songs and riddles and tales of saints and monsters. A grandparent might tell a story about a wolf that could speak like a man, or about a ghost that walked the road on the night of the full moon, or about a treasure buried under an oak tree that no one had ever found. The children listened with wide eyes, not sure if the stories were true, but knowing that the world was full of things they did not understand, and that fear was a reasonable response to the darkness beyond the door. The darkness outside was not empty. It was full of sounds. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of something small in the thatch, the distant bark of a fox, the creak of a tree branch rubbing against another branch. A peasant stepping outside after dark to use the privy or to check on the animals would see a sky so full of stars that it seemed crowded. The Milky Way, a pale river of light across the black. But they did not stop to admire it. They moved quickly because the night was cold and because there were things that moved in the dark, not monsters necessarily, but other humans who might be thieves or outlaws, or animals that might be wolves, or simply the unknown, which was worse than any specific danger. They completed their task and returned to the house, bolting the wooden door behind them. The animals shared the space under the same roof, in a separate area called the byre. The cow or the ox or the few sheep gave off heat, and that heat rose through the cracks in the wall, warming the human side of the house slightly. The smell of the animals was constant, the ammonia of urine, the sweet-sour smell of manure, the musky smell of fur and sweat. The peasant did not notice it anymore, or noticed it only when a visitor from another village commented on it, which was rare because all houses smelled the same. The animals were valuable, more valuable than the humans in a purely economic sense, because a dead ox meant no plowing, and no plowing meant no food, and no food meant death. So the animals were fed first, watered first, protected first. A peasant might go to bed hungry, but the ox would not. The fire was banked again, the coals covered with ash, the embers glowing a deep orange that faded to a dull red as the night wore on. The family lay down in their places, the parents on the bed if they had one, the children on the floor on mats of straw. The youngest child might sleep with the mother, for warmth and for the ease of nursing if the child was still an infant. The older children slept close together, their bodies forming a kind of knot, each one using the others for heat. The house was cold, so cold that the breath made small clouds in the air, and the sleeping peasants pulled their woolen blankets up over their heads, breathing the warm, stale air of their own exhalations. In the deepest part of the night, when the fire was nothing but a few hidden coals and the moon had set or had not yet risen, the silence was absolute. Not the silence of a modern room with its hum of electronics and distant traffic, but a silence so complete that the ear strained to hear something, anything, and found only the beating of its own blood. In that silence, the peasant might wake, as they often did, and lie there without moving, listening. The darkness was so thick that the eyes saw nothing, not the outline of the window, not the shape of the person lying next to them, nothing but the blackness inside their own eyelids. They would turn over, adjust the blanket, feel the cold floor through the straw beneath them. They would think about the work of the next day, or the pain in their knee, or the dream they had been having, which was already fading like smoke. Then they would close their eyes again and wait for sleep to return, which it always did, because the body demanded it, and the mind had no choice but to obey. Some nights the sleep did not return easily. The peasant would lie awake for what felt like hours, the darkness pressing on them, the small sounds of the house magnified, the scratch of a mouse in the thatch, the creak of a rafter settling, the deep, even breathing of the others. In those long, sleepless stretches, the mind turned to the old fears. The debt owed to the Lord, the child who had a cough that would not go away, the field that had produced less grain this year than last, the winter that was coming and the woodpile that was too small. There was no way to write these worries down, no one to tell who could change them, no plan that could be made in the dark that would survive the light of morning. So the peasant lay there, the worry turning in a slow circle, like a millstone grinding nothing. When the first cock crowed, far off in the village, the peasant knew that the night was ending. The gray light began to seep through the cracks in the shutters, not enough to see by but enough to remind the eye that color existed. The fire was rebuilt, the coals blown into flame, the pot hung over the hearth. The family stirred, the children whining softly, the mother coughing, the father spitting into the ashes. Another day had arrived, and it would be the same as the day before, and the day before that, and the day that would come after. The peasant put on the same clothes, ate the same bread, walked to the same field, and took hold of the same plow. The ox lowed, the sun rose, and the work began again. In the autumn, the work was different. The harvest was the most intense time of the year, the days spent in a frenzy of cutting, binding, and stacking. The whole village worked together, because the grain had to be brought in before the rains came and rotted it in the field. The reapers used sickles, curved blades that cut the stalks close to the ground, and they worked in long, steady strokes, their backs bent, their hands moving in a rhythm that had not changed in 1,000 years. The stalks were tied into sheaves, the sheaves stacked into shocks, the shocks left to dry in the field before being carried to the barn. The work began before dawn and ended after dusk, by torchlight if the moon was bright enough. The peasants ate in the field, slept in the field sometimes, too tired to walk back to the village. Their hands were cut by the sharp edges of the grain, their throats raw from the dust, their legs heavy with exhaustion. But the harvest was also a time of a kind of joy, though it was not a loud joy. It was the relief of seeing the grain in the barn, of knowing that there would be bread for the winter, that the family would not starve, that the Lord's share could be paid and something would remain. The peasants would hold a harvest supper, a rare meal with meat, maybe a chicken that was too old to lay eggs anymore, maybe a goose that had been fattened on the stubble. There would be ale, more than usual, and the adults would drink until their faces were red and their speech was slurred. They would sing songs that had no tune, only a rhythm, and they would dance in a circle on the hard-packed earth, the men and women holding hands, turning slowly, the firelight catching their faces. The children would watch from the edges, eating the scraps, falling asleep against the walls. And then the next morning the work would resume because the harvest was not finished, not really, until the last stalk was cut and the last sheaf was stacked and the last kernel was threshed from the ear. The threshing came after the harvest, in the long weeks of late autumn when the days were short and the cold was beginning to bite. The grain was spread on the floor of the barn, and the peasants beat it with wooden flails, 2 sticks joined by a leather thong. The flail rose and fell, a sound like soft thunder repeated thousands of times. The grain separated from the chaff, and then the winnowing began. The peasants tossed the mixture into the air with shallow baskets, and the wind carried the light chaff away while the heavy grain fell back to the floor. This was done in the open air on a windy day, and the peasants stood in the cold for hours, their hands blue, their faces turned away from the flying dust. The grain was stored in large clay jars or in sacks made of coarse cloth. Some was set aside for seed, some for the Lord, some for the mill, some for the family's own bread. The rest of the winter was a time of slower work, repairing tools, mending fences, cutting firewood, making new shoes from rawhide, weaving cloth on a simple loom. The animals were brought inside more often, fed on hay that had been cut in the summer and stored in the loft. The days were short, and the peasants spent more time in the house, sitting by the fire, their hands busy with small tasks. The cold seeped through the walls, through the floor, through the blankets, and there was no escape from it except the fire, and the fire required wood, and the wood required cutting, and the cutting required going outside into the cold again. The winter brought its own diseases. Colds and coughs spread through the village, turning into fevers, turning into pneumonias that killed the old and the very young. There was no medicine, no doctor, only the priest with his prayers and the old woman who knew which herbs to boil into a tea. The tea sometimes helped, sometimes did nothing, sometimes made things worse because the wrong herb had been picked. The peasants did not know which herbs worked and which did not. They only knew that some years more people died than other years, and that death was as much a part of life as birth, as ordinary as the turning of the season. The dead were wrapped in a sheet, carried to the churchyard, and buried in a hole that the men of the village had dug the day before. The priest said the words, the earth was thrown back in, and the mourners returned to their houses. There was no elaborate grief, not because the peasants did not feel it, but because they could not afford to stop working long enough to feel it fully. The grief was carried inside, a small weight added to the other weights, and it was expressed in small ways. A pause at the grave, a mention of the dead person's name at the evening meal, a sigh that was not quite a sigh. In the spring, the cycle began again. The plowing, the sowing, the weeding, the waiting for rain and sun in the right proportions. The peasants watched the sky with a constant, low-level anxiety, because too much rain or too little rain meant hunger. They watched the plants as they grew, checking for blight, for insects, for the pale patches that indicated disease. They pulled the weeds by hand, thousands of weeds, each one a small victory and a small defeat because more weeds would grow in its place. They walked the boundaries of their strips, checking the stones that marked the edges, making sure no one had moved them in the night. The work never ended, and the peasant never finished. There was always one more task, one more hour of light, One more load to carry before the body gave out and the darkness fell again. And so the years passed. The peasant grew older, their back curving, their hands becoming claws, their eyes clouding with cataracts. They married, had children, watched those children marry and have children of their own. They paid the Lord's rent, ground the grain at the mill, went to Mass on Sundays, confessed their sins to the priest, received the bread that they believed was the body of Christ. They died, usually in the winter, usually of a fever or a chill or simply of the accumulated weariness of a body that had been used too hard for too long. And someone else took their place, a child or a grandchild or a stranger who had wandered into the village and needed a home, and that person worked the same strips of land with the same plow, ate the same bread from the same wooden bowl, slept in the same house on the same straw, and looked up at the same stars in the same dark sky, wondering, perhaps, if this was all there was, and finding no answer because there was no answer, only the work and the waiting and the slow turning of the seasons. The night deepens now, the hour growing late, and the sounds of the modern world have faded into a distant hum that might be traffic or might be the wind. The room around you is still, the blankets heavy, the pillows soft in a way that no medieval peasant ever experienced. Their pillows were stuffed with straw or feathers if they were lucky, but most had no pillow at all, only a folded cloth or a small log. Their beds were hard, their rooms were cold, their lives were short and full of pain. And yet they slept, night after night, because sleep is not a luxury but a necessity, and the body takes it whether the conditions are right or wrong. So let your own body take it now. The slow drift into the dark, the breath slowing, the thoughts becoming fragments, the weight of the day lifting and scattering like chaff in the wind. There is no ending to this, no conclusion to reach, no lesson to learn. There is only the night, and the quiet, and the permission to rest. The fire is banked. The coals glow beneath the ash, and the darkness outside is full of stars, though you do not need to see them. You need only to close your eyes and let the silence hold you, for as long as it holds you, and then a little longer. The silence holds, and in that holding, the world of the peasant continues to turn, though no one is watching. The village settles into the rhythm of a season that is not quite winter and not quite spring. A gray time when the sky hangs low and the mud is deep. The peasants call this the hungry time, because the stores from the last harvest are running low and the new growth is not yet ready to eat. The bread becomes smaller, darker, cut with more chaff and sometimes with dried leaves or ground bark to make it stretch. The pottage is thinner, more water than vegetables, and the vegetables themselves are the last of the stored roots. Turnips that have grown soft and wrinkled, parsnips that have begun to sprout pale shoots in the dark of the cellar. The cellar is a hole in the ground beneath the house, reached by a ladder of rough-hewn wood. It is cold and damp and smells of earth and decay. The peasants store their root vegetables there, along with barrels of salted meat and crocks of preserved eggs sealed with a layer of fat. But by late winter, the barrels are empty and the crocks are scraped clean. The family gathers around the fire in the evening, and the mother divides the remaining food into portions that are too small for an adult but too large for a child to eat without guilt. The father watches his children chew, and he does not take his own portion until he has seen that they have had enough, or at least enough to stop the crying. The hunger is not a sharp pain but a dull one, a constant ache in the belly that makes sleep difficult and waking worse. In the forest, the peasants look for anything edible. The trees are still bare, but the first shoots of wild garlic push through the wet leaves, and the women gather them in handfuls, their fingers numb with cold. The shoots are chopped into the pottage, adding a sharp, clean taste that is almost forgotten after months of bland food. The children chew the raw shoots as they walk back to the village, their breath smelling of garlic for the rest of the day. The men set snares for rabbits along the edges of the clearings, checking them each morning before the sun is fully up. A rabbit is a small amount of meat, barely enough for one meal for a family of 6, but it is meat, and the bones are cracked open for the marrow and then boiled again to make a thin broth that tastes of nothing but warmth. The Lord's bailiff comes through the village once a week, a thin man on a thin horse, his face pinched with the same cold that pinches the peasants' faces. He carries a wooden tally stick, notched with the records of who has paid their rent and who has not. The peasants owe the Lord a portion of everything: a share of the grain, a share of the eggs, a share of the wool, a share of the lambs born in the spring. They also owe a certain number of days of labor on the Lord's domain, and if they cannot work because they are sick or because their own fields need them, they must pay a fine in grain or in coin. Most peasants never see a coin. Their economy is one of barter and obligation, a web of debts and favors that ties the village together and binds it to the Lord. The bailiff does not speak harshly, not usually, because he knows that harsh words do not produce grain that does not exist. But he notes the debts on his tally stick, and the debts grow, and the peasants know that someday the Lord will call in those debts, and they will have to give something they cannot spare. The church offers some relief, though not the relief of food. The priest reminds the peasants that hunger is a test from God, that the sufferings of this world are nothing compared to the joys of the next, that the poor are blessed because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The peasants listen, and some of them believe, and some of them do not, but all of them nod because it is not safe to argue with the priest. The church is also a place of ritual, and ritual is a comfort in a life that offers few comforts. The peasants light candles for the dead, kneel before the statue of the Virgin, touch the hem of the priest's robe as he passes. They believe in saints who protect against specific misfortunes: Saint Anthony against the burning sickness, Saint Roch against the plague, Saint Christopher against sudden death. They pray to these saints not with elaborate words but with simple repetitions, the same prayer said 100 times, 1,000 times, until the words lose their meaning and become only a sound, a vibration in the throat that fills the silence and keeps the dark thoughts away. The village has no physician, but it has the wise woman, an old widow who lives at the edge of the settlement in a house smaller than the others. Her hut is made of the same materials as the rest, but the smoke from her hearth smells different, because she burns herbs along with the wood. The peasants go to her when they are sick, and she gives them potions made from yarrow and nettle and the bark of the willow tree, which contains a substance that eases pain without curing the cause. She sets broken bones with splints of hazelwood, pulls rotten teeth with a pair of iron pliers, cleans wounds with honey and vinegar. Some of her treatments work, some do nothing, and some kill the patient faster than the disease would have done. But the peasants keep coming to her because there is no one else, and because she asks for nothing but a small gift: an egg, a piece of bread, a bundle of firewood carried to her door. The wise woman is also the keeper of certain older knowledge that the church does not approve of but cannot entirely suppress. She knows which mushrooms cause visions and which cause death. She knows the words to say to ward off the evil eye, the gestures to make to protect a newborn child, the herbs to place under the bed to encourage conception. She knows the phases of the moon and the best time to plant beans and the signs that predict a hard winter. The peasants do not call this magic. They call it wisdom, and they do not speak of it to the priest. In the quiet of the evening, sitting by the fire, a mother might whisper to her daughter the words that the wise woman taught her, and the daughter will memorize them and teach them to her own daughter in turn. A chain of knowledge that stretches back beyond memory, into a time before the church came to this land, when the old gods still walked in the forests and the springs were sacred. The children of the village grow up in this world, and they learn its rules without ever being taught explicitly. A child of 3 knows not to touch the fire. A child of 5 knows how to chase the crows from the field. A child of 7 knows how to milk the cow and how to tell when the cow is sick by the smell of its breath and the color of its eyes. A child of 9 knows how to handle a sling and how to skin a rabbit and how to find the path home when the fog rolls in from the river. There is no childhood in the modern sense, No long period of play and learning that is separate from the work of survival. The children play, yes, but their play is a rehearsal for work. They build small houses of sticks, they dig in the mud with sharpened sticks, they chase each other through the fields in games that mimic the chasing of animals or the chasing of thieves. Their toys are simple: a carved wooden horse, a doll made of rags, a ball of stitched leather stuffed with wool. They tire quickly because they are underfed, and they sleep deeply because they are exhausted, and they dream of food more often than they dream of anything else. The teenagers of the village are already adults in most ways that matter. A girl of 14 can keep a house, cook a meal, spin wool into thread, weave cloth on a loom, care for a baby, and work in the fields alongside her mother. A boy of 15 can plow a straight furrow, swing an axe without cutting his own leg, repair a thatched roof, and drive the oxen to market and back. Marriages happen young, not because of romance but because of necessity. Two families might agree to a union that joins their strips of land, or that settles a debt, or that provides a caregiver for an aging parent. The couple meets a few times, under the watchful eyes of their parents, and if they do not actively hate each other, the marriage goes forward. The wedding is a simple ceremony at the church door, followed by a feast that depletes the stores of both families for months. The bride wears her best dress, which is not white but whatever color the wool was dyed with onion skins or walnut husks. The groom wears his best tunic, which is not new but clean, or as clean as he can make it. They exchange vows in the local dialect, not in Latin, because the priest knows that the peasants understand nothing of the old language. Then they go to the groom's house, or to a new house that the families have built together, and they begin the work of making a life, which is the same work they have always done, only now they do it side by side. Pregnancy comes quickly, usually within the first year. The woman continues to work through most of the pregnancy, bending to pull weeds, carrying buckets of water from the stream, lifting the heavy iron pot from the fire. The neighbors watch her with a kind of practical concern, not because they feel sympathy but because a dead mother means a dead baby, and a dead baby means a wasted pregnancy, and wasted resources are a luxury the village cannot afford. When the birth begins, the woman withdraws to a corner of the house, behind a cloth hung from the rafters. The wise woman attends her, along with the other women of the village, who take turns holding the laboring woman's hand and wiping her forehead with a damp cloth. The men wait outside or go to the fields to work, because there is nothing they can do and the work does not stop for birth. The labor lasts hours, sometimes days. The woman screams, because the pain is unlike any other pain, a tearing and a pushing and a burning that seems as if it will never end. And then the baby comes, small and wet and screaming, and the wise woman ties the cord with a piece of thread and cuts it with a knife that she keeps for this purpose alone. The baby is washed in warm water, wrapped in a linen cloth, and placed in the mother's arms. The mother looks at the baby's face, at the tiny fingers and the closed eyes, and she feels something that is not quite love and not quite relief but a mixture of both, overlaid with the knowledge that this baby might not live, that half of all children die before their 5th year, that she must not become too attached too quickly. The baby is baptized within a day or two because unbaptized babies go to limbo, a place that is not hell but is not heaven either, and no mother wants that for her child. The priest sprinkles water on the baby's forehead and speaks the Latin words, and the baby cries, and the godparents promise to raise the child in the faith if the parents die. Then the mother takes the baby back to the house, and the work continues. She nurses the baby whenever it cries, day or night, because there is no formula and no bottle, only the breast. The nursing drains her body of calories she does not have, and she grows thinner, her breasts becoming sore and cracked, her milk sometimes drying up if the hunger is too great. If the milk dries, the baby is given to a neighbor who is still nursing, or fed on goat's milk from a leather bottle with a nipple made of cloth, or left to die because there is no other option. The peasants do not speak of this last option, but they know it happens, and they have learned not to name the baby until it has survived a year, because a name makes the death harder. The baby who survives the first year is no longer a baby but a child, and the child is put to work as soon as it can walk. The first tasks are simple. Carry this stick to your father, bring that handful of straw to the goat, sit here and do not move until I come back. The child learns obedience because disobedience means hunger, or a slap, or the cold silence of a parent who is too tired to speak. The child learns to watch the adults and copy their movements, to stand still when the bell rings for the Angelus, to bow the head when the priest passes. The child learns that the world is a hard place and that complaining makes it harder. And the child grows slowly, the body thin and scarred, the eyes old before their time, and becomes a teenager and marries and has children, and the cycle continues. The seasons turn and the village turns with them. The spring planting is done. The summer weeding is endless. The autumn harvest is a frenzy of work, and the winter is a slow waiting for death or for the return of the light. The peasants do not mark the years as modern people do. They do not celebrate birthdays because they do not know the date of their birth. They do not celebrate anniversaries because they do not remember the exact day of their wedding. They mark time by the feast days of the church: Christmas, Easter, Michaelmas, Martmas. These feasts are breaks in the routine, days when the work stops and the villagers gather in the churchyard or on the green. There is singing, not the organized singing of a choir, but the rough, spontaneous singing of people who have no other entertainment. There is dancing, the same dances that their grandparents danced, the steps passed down through the generations without being written down. There is drinking, more than usual, because the Lord often gives a barrel of ale to the village on feast days, a small gift that costs him little and buys their goodwill. At Christmas, the church is decorated with holly and ivy. The green of the plants, a reminder that life continues even in the dead of winter. The peasants bring the best of their remaining food to share in a common meal, a potluck of desperation that somehow becomes a celebration. The meat is tough and stringy, the bread is hard, the ale is flat, but the peasants eat and drink as if it were a feast of kings, because compared to their daily fare, it is. The children receive small gifts: a carved wooden animal, a piece of honeycomb, a new pair of shoes made from the hide of a cow that died in the autumn. The adults exchange promises rather than objects. I will help you repair your fence, you will help me bring in my hay, we will share the cost of a new plow blade. These promises are kept, because in a village where everyone knows everyone, a broken promise is a debt that cannot be hidden. At Easter, the church celebrates the resurrection of Christ, and the peasants see in that resurrection a promise of their own resurrection after death. They attend Mass in the early morning, standing in the cold church with the sun rising through the eastern window, the stained glass throwing colored light onto the dirt floor. The priest raises the host, the bell rings, and the peasants bow their heads, not fully understanding the theology but understanding that this moment is important, that something sacred is happening in the words they cannot understand. After Mass, they walk through the fields, carrying a wooden cross draped with a white cloth, blessing the new growth and asking God to protect the crops from hail and frost and blight. The women scatter holy water on the garden beds, on the beehives, on the doorways of the houses. The men bury a blessed egg in the corner of the field that has always produced the worst grain, hoping to change its luck. At Michaelmas, the end of September, the peasants pay the second installment of their rent, the first having been paid at the spring equinox. The Lord's bailiff comes with his tally stick, and the peasants bring their grain and their eggs and their wool, and the bailiff notches the stick to show that the debt is satisfied or that it is not. Those who cannot pay are given until Martmas, November 11th, but Martmas is the end of the agricultural year, the time when the animals that cannot be fed through the winter are slaughtered. The peasants who have not paid by Martmas are taken before the Lord's court, a panel of local men who serve at the Lord's pleasure, and they are fined an additional amount, or their goods are seized, or their land is taken from them and given to another peasant who can pay. This is not cruelty, not in the mind of the lord or the bailiff or the men of the court. It is simply the way things work. The land must produce, and the lord must have his share, and if a peasant cannot meet his obligations, someone else will. The peasants who lose their land become something worse than peasants. They become vagrants, wanderers with no home and no village to protect them. They walk the roads between towns, carrying what they can on their backs, sleeping in ditches and barns, begging for bread at the doors of houses where they once lived as neighbors. Some of them find work as day laborers on other lords' lands, hired for a season and then let go. Some of them join bands of outlaws who live in the forests, stealing sheep and robbing travelers and fighting among themselves. Some of them simply disappear, walking into the woods one day and never walking out, their bones found years later by a woodcutter, the identity impossible to determine because the clothes have rotted and the teeth are gone. The village does not speak of these people after they leave. They are a warning, a cautionary tale told to children who complain about their work. Eat your bread and do not argue, or you will end like the Harlow family, walking the road with nothing but the clothes on your back, and no one will open their door to you. The roads themselves are not roads in the modern sense. They are dirt tracks, worn by centuries of feet and hooves and cart wheels, that connect the villages to each other and to the market towns. In dry weather, they are dusty, the dust rising in clouds that coat the traveler from head to foot. In wet weather, they are muddy, the mud deep enough to swallow a cartwheel to the axle. The peasants do not travel often because travel takes time and time is work, and work is survival. But sometimes they must travel, to the mill with the grain, to the market to sell a pig or a bolt of cloth, to the church in the next village for a Saint's Day festival, to the Lord's manor house to pay the rent or perform the labor service. These journeys are slow, a day's walk to cover 10 miles, the ox pulling the cart at a pace that seems to mock the very idea of urgency. The traveler carries food for the journey, a piece of bread and a small piece of cheese wrapped in a cloth, and a flask of small beer, and a stick to ward off dogs or, in the more remote areas, wolves. The wolves are real, not just stories to frighten children. They live in the deep forests, in the places where the trees grow so close together that the sun never reaches the ground. In winter, when the deer are scarce, the wolves come closer to the villages, their howls echoing across the fields at night, a sound that makes the hair stand up on the back of the neck. The peasants keep their animals locked in the byre, the door barred with a heavy beam, but sometimes the wolves dig under the wall or find a gap in the thatch, and in the morning the peasant finds the sheep dead, the throat torn out, the blood frozen in a black pool on the snow. The men of the village organize wolf hunts, driving the animals into a clearing and killing them with spears and arrows. But the wolves are clever and they learn to avoid the hunts, and they return the next winter and the next and the next, a permanent presence at the edge of the human world. A reminder that the wild has not been tamed and will not be tamed, not by peasants with sticks and spears, not by anyone. The night deepens further, the hours passing unmarked, the world outside the window becoming a featureless dark. The peasant's world also darkens, the fire burning down to a few red embers, the family asleep in their places, the sound of breathing the only sound in the room. The mother wakes briefly, feeling the cold on her face, and pulls the blanket higher. The father turns over, mumbling something in his sleep, a word that might be a prayer or a curse or the name of a cow. The baby stirs, roots for the breast, finds it, and sucks in a rhythm that is not quite regular, a pattern of pauses and swallows that the mother feels more than hears. She does not look at the baby. She does not need to look. She knows the weight of the baby against her side, the warmth of the small body, the smell of milk and sleep, and the faint sourness of the cloth diaper that will need to be changed before morning. She closes her eyes, and sleep returns, pulling her down into a darkness that is not the same as the darkness of the room but a different darkness, a private darkness, a darkness that belongs only to her. And the night continues, as nights do, indifferent to the lives being lived beneath it. The stars will overhead, the constellations shifting with the seasons, the same stars that the peasants see when they step outside to check on the animals, the same stars that their ancestors saw 1,000 years before, the same stars that will be seen 1,000 years from now, by people who will have no memory of the peasants or their small, hard lives. The moon rises, casting a pale light on the thatched roofs, on the muddy lane, on the wooden cross at the edge of the village where the road bends toward the forest. A dog barks once, twice, and then falls silent. The wind picks up, moving through the bare branches of the trees, making a sound like the sea, like the breathing of something very large and very old and very tired. The peasants sleep, and the world turns, and the hours pass, and there is no end to any of this, only a continuation. A slow and steady movement from one moment to the next, from one darkness to another darkness, from one small fire to the next small fire, lit by hands that will soon be dust. The dust settles on everything. It settles on the wooden bowl left on the hearth, on the spindle of wool beside the bed, on the small shrine in the corner of the room where a carved wooden figure of the Virgin stands, her painted face worn smooth by the touch of fingers over many years. The dust is not the dust of neglect but the dust of daily life, the fine powder of ashes and dried mud and fragments of straw that floats through the air and lands on every surface, only to be stirred up again by the next movement, the next passing, the next breath. The peasant does not wipe the dust away because wiping would be endless, and there is no point in fighting a thing that will return before the wiping is complete. The morning comes again, as it always does, and the peasant opens eyes that feel as if they have been closed for only a moment. The gray light through the shutters is the same gray light as yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. The fire is rebuilt, the pot is hung, the bread is cut. The peasant eats standing up, not because there is urgency but because sitting requires a decision, and decisions require energy, and energy is a resource that must be hoarded like grain in the winter. The bread is chewed slowly, the jaw moving in a circular motion, the teeth grinding the coarse fragments into a paste that is swallowed with a swallow that is almost a sigh. The small beer is flat and warm, but it wets the throat, and that is enough. Outside, the village is waking. A door opens across the lane, and a woman emerges carrying a bucket, her feet bare on the cold ground. She walks to the well at the center of the village, a stone circle with a wooden roof, the rope hanging down into the dark water below. She lowers the bucket, hears the splash, hauls it up hand over hand, the rope rough against her palms. The water sloshes over the rim of the bucket as she carries it back, leaving a dark trail on the packed earth. Another door opens, and a man comes out with an axe over his shoulder, walking toward the woodpile at the edge of the village. The sound of the axe begins, a rhythmic thunk that echoes off the walls of the houses, a sound that will continue for most of the morning, because firewood is never enough, and the cold is never finished. The children are the last to emerge, dragged from sleep by the voices of their mothers. They stand in the doorways, rubbing their eyes, their hair matted from the night, their clothes twisted around their thin bodies. A small girl of perhaps 4 years old sits down in the mud and begins to cry, not from pain or hunger but from the simple, overwhelming fact of being awake again, of having to face another day of the same small struggles. Her mother picks her up without speaking, carries her back inside, and returns a moment later with the girl quieted, a piece of bread in her hand. The girl eats the bread as she walks toward the edge of the village, following the other children who are already heading to the fields, where they will spend the morning chasing birds and gathering stones and doing the small tasks that are too tedious for the adults but too necessary to ignore. The fields stretch out beyond the village, a patchwork of strips divided by narrow paths of grass. The spring planting is finished, and the young shoots are visible now, pale green lines against the dark brown of the soil. The peasant walks to his own strips, his feet following a path he has walked thousands of times, a path so familiar that he does not see it anymore. He carries a hoe, a wooden handle with an iron blade, the blade worn thin from years of use. He begins to weed, the blade cutting into the soil just below the surface, slicing the roots of the weeds that compete with the grain for water and nutrients. The motion is repetitive. Lift the hoe, bring it down, pull it back, lift it again. The peasant does not count the strokes. He does not think about the strokes. His body knows the motion, and his mind drifts elsewhere, to the ache in his shoulder, to the taste of the bread still in his mouth, to the sound of the lark singing somewhere above him. A small, high sound that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The lark is a sign of summer, of the long days that are coming, of the heat that will bake the soil and make the grain grow tall. The peasant does not think of the lark as beautiful, not in the way a modern person might. He thinks of the lark as a marker, a signal that the season is advancing, that the time for weeding will soon give way to the time for harvesting, that the work will change and then change again, and that somewhere in the middle of all this change there might be a moment of rest, a single evening when the work is done and the fire is warm and the belly is full, and the children are asleep and the world is quiet, and for just a few hours, the weight of survival is not pressing on his chest. Those moments are rare, and they are never announced. They arrive without warning and depart without farewell, leaving behind only the memory of a feeling, a sense that for a little while, things were almost all right. The afternoon sun climbs higher, and the shadow of the peasant shrinks until it is a small dark circle around his feet. The sweat runs down his back, soaking the wool of his tunic, and the flies gather around his face, landing on the corners of his mouth, on the rims of his eyes. He does not swat them away because swatting requires lifting a hand from the hoe, and lifting a hand from the hoe means stopping the work, and stopping the work means the weeds will grow, and the weeds will choke the grain, and the grain will be less, and the winter will be harder. So he lets the flies crawl on his skin, feeling their tiny feet, their small weight, their persistence. They are part of the world as he is part of the world, and there is no separating the two. In the middle of the afternoon, a bell rings from the church. It is not the Angelus but a different bell, a smaller bell, rung for a funeral. The peasant stops his work and looks toward the village, where a small procession is moving from the church to the graveyard. The body is carried on a wooden bier, covered with a white cloth, the priest walking in front with a cross held high. A few mourners follow, women mostly, their heads covered with white linen, their faces hidden in shadow. The peasant cannot see who has died from this distance, but he will learn soon enough, when he returns to the village in the evening and the neighbors share the news. It will be an old person, probably, or a young child, because those are the ones who die in the spring, when the body is weak from the winter and the new diseases are spreading. The peasant watches the procession for a moment, then lowers his head and returns to the weeding. The dead are dead, and the living must work. The funeral ends, and the graveyard receives another inhabitant. The grave is shallow because the ground is still cold from the winter, and the diggers have hit a layer of clay that resisted their shovels. The body is lowered into the hole, the priest says the words, and the earth is thrown back in, a sound like soft thunder, like the thud of a hoe, like the closing of a door. The mourners stand in silence for a moment, then turn and walk back to the village, their heads still bowed, their steps slow. They will eat a meal together in the dead person's house, a meal that the dead person would have helped to prepare if they were still alive. They will speak the dead person's name a few times, and then they will stop because speaking the name too often is bad luck, or so the old women say. The dead person will become a memory, and the memory will fade, and within a generation, no one will remember the name at all. That is the way of things in a village where nothing is written down, where the only record of a life is the mark it leaves on the lives of others, a mark that is erased by time as surely as the footprints in the lane are erased by the next rain. The rain comes in the evening. Not a storm, but a steady, gentle rain that falls straight down. The drops hitting the thatch with a soft, continuous sound. The peasant returns from the field, his clothes wet, his hair plastered to his forehead. He stands by the fire, letting the warmth dry his skin, the steam rising from his shoulders. The family gathers around the hearth, the children sitting close to the flames, their faces glowing in the orange light. The mother stirs the pottage, adding a handful of wild garlic that the children gathered in the afternoon, the green leaves wilting into the brown broth. The smell fills the room, a smell of earth and herbs and the faint sweetness of old grain. The peasant takes the wooden bowl that is his, the one with a small chip on the rim that he has known since childhood, and holds it out to his wife. She fills it with a ladle, the pottage dripping from the bottom of the ladle as she lifts it, and he takes the bowl and sits on the bench by the fire, cradling the warmth in his hands. The meal is eaten in silence, as most meals are. The only sounds are the clink of the spoons against the bowls, the crackle of the fire, the rain on the roof. The baby nurses at the mother's breast, a small, wet sound that blends with the other sounds into a single, continuous texture. The father finishes his pottage and sets the bowl down, leaning back against the wall, his eyes half closed. He is not sleeping, not yet, but he is resting, his body relaxing into the warmth after the cold of the field. The children finish their bowls and set them down, and the oldest girl, perhaps 8 years old, takes the bowls to a bucket of water and begins to wash them with a cloth, her hands moving in small circles, her face serious with the responsibility of the task. The rain continues through the night, a soft, persistent presence that wraps the village in a blanket of sound. The peasants go to bed early, because there is nothing else to do, because the fire is warm and the blankets are dry and the darkness outside is complete. They lie in their places, listening to the rain, feeling the occasional drop that finds its way through a gap in the thatch and lands on the floor or on a face. The drop is cold, startling, a small intrusion of the outside world into the fragile warmth of the interior. But the peasant does not get up to fix the leak, because fixing the leak would require a ladder and daylight and a bundle of new thatch, and none of those things are available in the dark. So the peasant turns over, pulls the blanket higher, and lets the rain fall where it will. The peasant watches the procession for a moment, then lowers his head and returns to the weeding. The dead are dead, and the living must work. The funeral ends, and the graveyard receives another inhabitant. The grave is shallow because the ground is still cold from the winter, and the diggers have hit a layer of clay that resisted their shovels. The body is lowered into the hole, the priest says the words, and the earth is thrown back in, a sound like soft thunder, like the thud of a hoe, like the closing of a door. The mourners stand in silence for a moment, then turn and walk back to the village, their heads still bowed, their steps slow. They will eat a meal together in the dead person's house, a meal that the dead person would have helped to prepare if they were still alive. They will speak the dead person's name a few times, and then they will stop because speaking the name too often is bad luck, or so the old women say. The dead person will become a memory, and the memory will fade, and within a generation, no one will remember the name at all. That is the way of things in a village where nothing is written down, where the only record of a life is the mark it leaves on the lives of others, a mark that is erased by time as surely as the footprints in the lane are erased by the next rain. The rain comes in the evening, not a storm but a steady, gentle rain that falls straight down, the drops hitting the thatch with a soft, continuous sound. The peasant returns from the field, his clothes wet, his hair plastered to his forehead. He stands by the fire, letting the warmth dry his skin, the steam rising from his shoulders. The family gathers around the hearth, the children sitting close to the flames, their faces glowing in the orange light. The mother stirs the pottage, adding a handful of wild garlic that the children gathered in the afternoon, the green leaves wilting into the brown broth. The smell fills the room, a smell of earth and herbs and the faint sweetness of old grain. The peasant takes the wooden bowl that is his, the one with a small chip on the rim that he has known since childhood, and holds it out to his wife. She fills it with a ladle, the pottage dripping from the bottom of the ladle as she lifts it, and he takes the bowl and sits on the bench by the fire, cradling the warmth in his hands. The meal is eaten in silence, as most meals are. The only sounds are the clink of the spoons against the bowls, the crackle of the fire, the rain on the roof. The baby nurses at the mother's breast, a small, wet sound that blends with the other sounds into a single, continuous texture. The father finishes his pottage and sets the bowl down, leaning back against the wall, his eyes half closed. He is not sleeping, not yet, but he is resting, his body relaxing into the warmth after the cold of the field. The children finish their bowls and set them down, and the oldest girl, perhaps 8 years old, takes the bowls to a bucket of water and begins to wash them with a cloth, her hands moving in small circles, her face serious with the responsibility of the task. The rain continues through the night, a soft, persistent presence that wraps the village in a blanket of sound. The peasants go to bed early, because there is nothing else to do, because the fire is warm and the blankets are dry and the darkness outside is complete. They lie in their places, listening to the rain, feeling the occasional drop that finds its way through a gap in the thatch and lands on the floor or on a face. The drop is cold, startling, a small intrusion of the outside world into the fragile warmth of the interior. But the peasant does not get up to fix the leak, because fixing the leak would require a ladder and daylight and a bundle of new thatch, and none of those things are available in the dark. So the peasant turns over, pulls the blanket higher, and lets the rain fall where it will. The rain stops sometime before dawn, and the world is washed clean, the air fresh and cold, the mud deep and sticky. The peasant wakes to the sound of birds, a chorus of small voices that fills the gray light. The fire has died completely, the coals cold and white, and the peasant must borrow a coal from the neighbor, walking across the lane in bare feet, knocking on the wooden door, accepting the glowing ember on a piece of pottery, carrying it back carefully, shielding it from the damp air with a cupped hand. The neighbor does not speak because it is too early for speaking, and because the borrowing of coals is a daily transaction, as routine as breathing. The peasant blows on the ember, adds dry straw, and the flame returns, small and hesitant at first, then growing, reaching for the twigs, the kindling, the log. The day begins, and the work begins, and the cycle continues. The peasant hoes the weeds, and the weeds grow back. The peasant repairs the fence, and the fence rots. The peasant carries water from the well, and the water is used, and the water must be carried again. There is no end to any of these tasks, no point at which the peasant can stand back and say, "This is finished." The only finish is death, and death is not an ending but a transition, a movement from the world of the living to the world of the dead, which is not so different from the world of the living, or so the priest says. In the world of the dead, there is no work, no hunger, no cold, no rain that finds its way through the thatch. There is only the presence of God, a presence that is described as light and warmth and peace, though the peasant has difficulty imagining these things, because light and warmth and peace are not experiences that have been abundant in the peasant's life. The peasant imagines heaven as a place without weeds, without debt, without the bailiff's tally stick, without the sound of the axe in the morning and the ache in the back in the evening. That is enough. That is a kind of hope, thin and pale but persistent, like the flame that survives the night under the ash. The summer passes, and the grain grows tall, the stalks heavy with the ripening ears. The fields turn from green to gold, a color that the peasant associates not with beauty but with anxiety, because the gold means the harvest is near, and the harvest is the most critical time of the year. The peasant walks through the fields, pulling a few grains from an ear, crushing them between the teeth, feeling the hardness, tasting the sweetness. Not yet, not quite yet. A few more days of sun, a few more days of warmth, and then the work will begin, the work that will consume every waking hour for weeks, the work that will determine whether the family eats or starves. In the days before the harvest, the village prepares. The sickles are sharpened, the blades rubbed with a stone until they gleam in the sunlight. The carts are repaired, the wheels greased with animal fat, the axles checked for cracks. The barns are cleaned, the old straw swept out, the floors swept clean, ready to receive the new grain. The peasants rest more than usual because the harvest will demand everything they have, and they must enter it with bodies that are not already exhausted. They eat a little more, dipping into the stores that are meant for the winter, knowing that the new grain will replace what they take. They sleep a little longer, the sun rising earlier each day, the mornings warm and still. And then the day comes. The peasant wakes before dawn, not to the cock but to an internal sense, a knowing that the time has arrived. The sky is clear, the stars still visible, the air cool and fresh. The family eats a larger breakfast than usual, a bowl of porridge with a knob of butter, a piece of cheese, a cup of ale. They dress in their oldest clothes because the harvest is dirty work, and the clothes will be stained and torn. They walk to the field, the whole family together, the father carrying the sickle, the mother carrying a cloth bag with bread and cheese and a flask of ale, the children carrying nothing but their own small hands, which will be put to work as soon as the sun is fully up. The field is a sea of gold, the stalks bending under the weight of the grain. The peasant stands at the edge for a moment, looking out over the field, feeling the weight of the task ahead. Then he steps into the stalks, the first step of many, and begins to cut. The sickle moves in a smooth arc, the blade catching the stalks just below the ear, cutting them cleanly, leaving the straw standing in the field. The peasant gathers the cut stalks in his left hand, forming a bundle, then lays the bundle on the ground behind him. The motion is fluid, practiced, the result of years of repetition. He does not think about the motion. He only moves and the stalks fall and the bundles grow and the field shrinks. The sun rises and the heat rises with it. The peasant's back begins to ache, the muscles complaining after the first hour, then settling into a dull, persistent pain that becomes part of the background, like the flies, like the sweat, like the thirst. The mother brings the flask of ale, and the peasant drinks, the warm liquid running down his chin, dripping onto the cut stalks. He wipes his mouth with the back of his hand and returns to the work. The children follow behind him, gathering the bundles and stacking them into shocks, the bundles leaning against each other in a cone shape that will shed the rain if it comes. Their hands are small and they can only carry one bundle at a time, but they are persistent, and the shocks grow as the morning passes. By midday, the peasant has cut a swath across the field, a lane of bare straw behind him, the shocks standing like small sentinels in the sun. He stops to eat, sitting on the ground in the shadow of a shock, the bread and cheese tasting better than any food has ever tasted, the ale sweeter than any wine. The family sits together, not speaking, their faces flushed with heat and effort, their eyes fixed on the field that remains. Half of the field is still standing, the stalks waiting for the sickle, the grain waiting to be cut. The peasant calculates the time it will take, the days of work that remain, and finds the number acceptable. The harvest will be finished before the rains come, or so he hopes, because hope is all he has. The afternoon is harder than the morning, the heat more intense, the body more tired. The peasant's hand cramps around the handle of the sickle, the fingers refusing to close fully, the grip weakening. He switches hands, cutting with his left hand for a while, the motion awkward and slow, but better than stopping. The sun moves across the sky, and the shadow of the shock shifts, and the peasant follows the shadow, cutting, bundling, laying the bundles on the ground. The mother works beside him now, her own sickle in her hand, her strokes shorter but no less steady. The children have stopped stacking and are gathering the fallen ears that have dropped from the bundles, putting them into a cloth bag, because every grain matters, and a fallen ear is a loaf of bread that will not be baked. The sun sets, and the work stops, not because the work is done but because the light is gone. The peasant walks back to the village, his feet heavy, his shoulders burning, his hands raw. The family follows, the children stumbling with exhaustion, the mother carrying the bag of fallen ears, the father carrying the sickles. They eat a quick meal of cold pottage and bread, and they fall into their beds without washing, without speaking, without even taking off their clothes. They sleep as the dead sleep, without dreams, without movement, without awareness of the world around them. And in the morning they wake and do it all again. The harvest continues for days, sometimes weeks, depending on the size of the fields and the number of hands available. The peasants work from dawn until dusk, 7 days a week, because the harvest does not respect the Sabbath, and God, they believe, will understand. The grain is cut, stacked, dried, carried to the barn, threshed, winnowed, stored. The straw is gathered, stacked into ricks that will feed the animals through the winter. The fields are left bare, the stubble short and sharp, the earth exhausted but resting at last. The peasants stand at the edge of the finished field and look out over the bare earth, and they feel something that is not quite satisfaction but is close, a sense that a door has been closed, a task completed, a danger averted. The grain is in the barn. The winter will come, but the winter will not bring starvation. Not this year, not for this family. And that is enough. The autumn arrives, and the work changes again. The peasants thresh the grain, beating the stalks with flails, the sound a rhythmic thunder that echoes through the village from morning until night. The chaff is separated from the grain, tossed into the air on windy days, the chaff blowing away like brown snow, the grain falling back to the ground in a golden shower. The grain is measured, a portion set aside for the Lord, a portion set aside for seed, a portion set aside for the mill, a portion set aside for the family's bread. The peasants watch the piles of grain shrink as each portion is taken away, and they calculate how long the remaining grain will last, how many loaves of bread it will make, how many bowls of pottage it will thicken. The calculation is never reassuring. The grain always looks like more than it is, and the winter always lasts longer than it should, and the family always eats more than they planned, because hunger is a poor advisor, and the belly does not understand arithmetic. The winter comes, and the village retreats into itself. The doors are closed, the shutters are sealed, the fires are kept burning as long as the wood lasts. The peasants spend their days indoors, doing the tasks that can be done by firelight, mending, weaving, carving, telling stories. The children grow restless, cooped up in the small room, and the parents grow short-tempered, their nerves frayed by the constant presence of each other, the lack of privacy, the small irritations that become large in the confined space. A child cries, and the mother snaps at the child, and the father snaps at the mother, and the silence that follows is heavy with resentment and the knowledge that there is nowhere to go, no escape from the room or from each other. The winter is also a time of sickness. The cough that began in the autumn becomes a fever, the fever becomes a rattling in the chest, the rattling becomes a stillness. The wise woman comes with her herbs, but the herbs do nothing, and the person dies, and the body must be buried in the frozen ground, the grave dug with picks because the shovels cannot penetrate the frost. The funeral is brief, the mourners stamping their feet to keep warm, their breath clouding in the air. The priest speaks the words quickly, his own hands cold, his own patience thin. The body is lowered into the grave, and the frozen clods of earth are thrown back in, bouncing off the wooden coffin with a sound like stones hitting a door. The mourners return to their houses, and the dead person is gone. Another absence in a village full of absences. The spring comes, and the cycle begins again. The plowing, the sowing, the weeding, the waiting. The peasant grows older, the body wearing down like a tool that has been used too long and sharpened too many times. The back curves, the hands knot, the eyes dim. The peasant's children grow up and marry and have children of their own, and the peasant becomes a grandparent, a figure of age and authority, the keeper of the stories and the songs and the knowledge of which mushrooms are safe to eat and which will kill. The peasant sits by the fire in the evening, not working anymore, not able to work, the body finally broken by the decades of labor. The younger people do the work now, and the peasant watches, offering advice that is sometimes taken and sometimes ignored, speaking of the old days, the hard winters, the good harvests, the people who are dead and the people who are not yet born. And then the peasant dies, as all peasants die, in the winter usually, of a fever or a chill or simply of the accumulated weariness of a body that has been used too hard for too long. The family gathers around the bed, if the peasant has a bed, and the priest comes with the last rites, and the peasant receives the bread that is the body of Christ, and then the eyes close and the breathing stops and the room is quiet. The women wash the body and wrap it in a sheet, and the men dig the grave and the bell rings, and the procession moves from the house to the church to the graveyard, and the words are spoken, and the earth is thrown, and the peasant is gone. Another name added to the list of names that no one will remember in a generation. But the village continues. The fields are plowed, the grain is sown, the weeds are pulled, the harvest is gathered, the winter is endured. The children become parents, the parents become grandparents, the grandparents become memories, and the memories become dust. The cycles turn, indifferent to the individuals who live within them, and the peasants live and die and are forgotten, and the world does not notice, because the world is large and the peasants are small, and the work of the world is not the work of remembering but the work of continuing, the slow and steady movement of the seasons, the rising and setting of the sun, the falling of the rain, the growth of the grain, the baking of the bread, the eating of the bread, the hunger that follows the eating, the sleep that follows the hunger, and the waking that follows the sleep, again and again, without end, without purpose, without meaning beyond the meaning that the peasants themselves create in the small spaces between the work, in the quiet moments by the fire, in the touch of a hand on a child's head, in the taste of the first bread made from the new grain, in the sound of the lark above the field, in the warmth of the blanket on a cold night, in the simple fact of being alive, which is not a choice but an accident, and not a happy accident or a sad accident but just an accident. A thing that happens, a thing that continues, a thing that will continue until it does not, and then it will be over, and the silence that follows will be the same silence that existed before, a silence that does not care, a silence that is not waiting, a silence that is simply there, like the darkness outside the window, like the darkness behind the closed eyes, like the darkness that is not an absence but a presence that holds everything and asks nothing, a presence that is the opposite of hunger and the opposite of cold, a presence that is the end of all work and the beginning of nothing at all. The fire burns low, the embers glowing red, then fading, then glowing again. The night is deep, the hour unknown, the world outside the window still and dark. The peasant sleeps and the listener sleeps, and there is no difference between the two sleeps, no boundary between the medieval night and this night, no separation between the breath that filled the peasant's lungs and the breath that fills the listener's lungs now. The air is the same air, the darkness is the same darkness, the quiet is the same quiet. And the hours pass, and the cycle turns, and the narration continues, not toward an ending but away from one, drifting like smoke, like chaff in the wind, like the last ember of a fire that has burned for 1,000 years and will burn for 1,000 more, and the peasant is there, in the smoke, in the chaff, in the ember, and the listener is there, and the night is there, and the silence holds them both, and holds them still, and holds them quiet, and holds them until the morning comes, or until the morning does not come, and either way it is enough. The morning does come, and the morning does not care whether it is welcome. The light pushes through the cracks in the shutters, thin and gray at first, then thicker, more insistent, until it finds the sleeping faces and touches the eyelids with a pale warmth. The peasant stirs, not because the light is bright, but because the body has learned, over years of the same routine, that light means movement, and movement means the fire, and the fire means the day. The shift from sleep to waking is slow, a gradual ascent from the deep dark of the unconscious to the shallow gray of the half-awake, and then to the full awareness of the room, the smell of the ashes, the sound of the animals in the byre, the weight of the blanket that is not quite heavy enough. The neighbor's cock crows, a ragged sound that tears through the morning quiet. Another cock answers from the other end of the village, and another, a chain of rough voices that announce the arrival of the day, whether the peasants are ready or not. The peasant sits up, the joints complaining, the spine cracking in 2 or 3 places. The feet find the floor, the cold rising from the packed earth like water rising through a cloth. The peasant stands, and the day begins. The fire is rebuilt, the coals coaxed back to life with the same gentle breath that has coaxed them for years. The pot is hung, the water added, the handful of grain stirred into the water with a wooden spoon. The porridge will take time, and time is the one thing the peasant has in abundance, though it never feels that way. While the porridge cooks, the peasant goes to the byre to tend the animals. The cow is lowing, her udder swollen with milk that has accumulated through the night. The peasant sits on a low stool, places a wooden bucket between the knees, and begins to milk. The milk comes in thin streams, hitting the side of the bucket with a sound like rain on a roof, a sound that is steady and rhythmic and almost musical. The cow stands still, her breath warm on the peasant's shoulder, her tail swishing at the flies that have already found their way into the byre despite the early hour. The milk is carried back to the house, where the mother takes it and pours it into a clay crock, covering it with a cloth to keep out the dust. Some of the milk will be drunk fresh, a rare treat that the children will beg for and receive in small cups. Some will be left to sour into buttermilk, which will be used in the bread. Some will be churned into butter, a long and tedious process that involves shaking a wooden churn for hours, the arm aching, the shoulder burning, until the butter separates from the buttermilk in a single soft mass. The butter will be salted and stored in a crock, a small luxury that will flavor the pottage and the bread through the winter. The mother does these things without thinking, her hands moving through the motions as automatically as the peasant's hands move through the motions of the plow. She has done them thousands of times, and she will do them thousands of times more, and the butter will be made, and the bread will be baked, and the children will be fed, and the cycle will continue. The porridge is ready, thick and gray, steaming in the morning cold. The family gathers around the hearth, each person taking a bowl, each person eating in the same slow, methodical way. The porridge is bland, almost tasteless, but it is warm and it fills the stomach, and that is enough. The children eat quickly, eager to finish so they can go outside, where the morning is fresh and the puddles from last night's rain are waiting to be splashed. The mother watches them with a tired eye, noting that the younger one's shoes are wearing thin, that the older one's tunic is getting too short, that there is work to be done and not enough hands to do it. The father finishes his porridge and sets the bowl down, already thinking about the field, about the weeds that have grown since yesterday, about the clouds on the horizon that might bring rain or might bring nothing. The day's work is different today, because today is a boon day, a day when the peasants must work on the Lord's domain instead of their own strips. The Lord's land lies to the north of the village, a large, open field that is better drained than the common fields, with deeper soil and fewer stones. The Lord's crops are always healthier than the peasants' crops, because the Lord's land is better, because the Lord's animals are better fed, because the Lord's peasants are required to work on his land first. when the weather is best and the conditions are most favorable. The peasant resents this, not with a hot resentment but with a cold, familiar resentment, the kind that has been passed down through generations and has become as much a part of the peasant's identity as the calluses on the hands and the ache in the back. But the resentment does not change anything, and the peasant picks up the hoe and walks to the Lord's field, joining the other peasants who are walking in the same direction, a silent line of bent figures against the pale morning sky. The Lord's field is large, larger than any of the peasants' strips, and the work is the same as the work on their own land. Weeding, hoeing, turning the soil, breaking the clods. But the work feels different here, heavier somehow, because the benefit of the work will go to someone else, because the grain that grows from this soil will be ground into flour that will be baked into bread that will be eaten by the Lord and his family and his retainers, while the peasant's own family will eat bread made from the poorer grain of the poorer field, bread that is darker and coarser and less nourishing. The peasant does not dwell on this difference because dwelling would be a kind of torture, and the peasant has learned not to torture himself with thoughts that cannot be changed. He works, and the sun climbs, and the sweat runs, and the hours pass, and the field slowly transforms from a patch of weeds and clods into a smooth, clean expanse of dark soil, ready for the seed. At midday, the Lord's steward provides a meal for the workers, a gesture that is not generosity but calculation, because a fed peasant works harder than a hungry peasant. The meal is simple: a large pot of pottage, a loaf of white bread, a jug of ale that is stronger than the small beer the peasants drink at home. The peasants sit in a circle on the ground, eating from their own bowls, drinking from their own cups, their faces turned toward the sun. They do not speak much because they are tired, because the meal is short, because the work awaits. But there is a kind of community in the silence, a shared understanding that they are all in the same position, all bound to the same Lord, all working the same land for the same small reward. The young man sitting next to the peasant is from the other end of the village, and the peasant knows his father and his grandfather and the name of the cow that died last winter. They are not friends, not in the modern sense, but they are connected by the land and the work and the village, a web of relationships that holds them all in place. The afternoon is long, the sun hot, the work monotonous. The peasant's mind drifts again, as it often does, to the small details of his own life. The fence that needs mending, the roof that leaks in the corner, the pig that is getting fat enough to sell at the next market. These thoughts are not worries, not exactly. They are more like a list, a mental inventory of tasks and resources, a way of keeping track of the world so that nothing is forgotten and nothing is wasted. The peasant's mind is not a modern mind, full of abstract ideas and distant concerns. It is a practical mind, focused on the immediate, the tangible, the necessary. The peasant does not think about the king or the pope or the distant wars that are fought in the names of kings and popes. The peasant thinks about the cow, the pig, the fence, the roof, the field, the grain, the bread. These things are the world, and the world is small and manageable and completely absorbing. The sun begins to set, and the steward releases the peasants from their work. They gather their tools and walk back to the village, their shadows long before them, their steps slow with fatigue. The peasant's hands are blistered from the hoe, the skin red and tender, but he does not complain because complaining is pointless, and because the blisters will harden into calluses, and the calluses will protect him for the next day's work, and the next, and the next. The village appears in the distance, the smoke rising from the chimneys, the church tower dark against the orange sky. The peasant feels a small lift in his chest, not quite pleasure but a kind of relief, the relief of returning to a place that is known, a place that is his, even if only in the smallest and most conditional sense. The evening meal is the same as always: pottage, bread, a cup of small beer. The family sits together, the children tired and quiet, the mother's hands busy with the spindle as she eats. The father looks at his children, at their thin faces and their tired eyes, and he feels something that he does not have a name for, a mixture of love and worry and the dull, persistent awareness that he cannot protect them from the world, that the world will use them as it has used him, that their lives will be as hard as his and probably harder, because the climate is changing, because the Lord is demanding more, because the population is growing and the land is not growing with it. He does not say any of this because there is no point in saying it, and because the children would not understand, and because the words would only make the silence heavier. The seasons turn and the years turn with them. The peasant watches his children grow, and he watches his own body decline, and he watches the village change in small, almost imperceptible ways. A new family moves into the house at the end of the lane, refugees from a village that was burned in a raid, their faces scarred, their clothes torn, their few possessions carried in a single cart. The villagers welcome them with the cautious hospitality of people who have little to spare, giving them bread and ale and a place to sleep in the barn until they can build a house of their own. The new family brings news of the wider world, news that the peasants listen to with a kind of distant interest, like people listening to a story that does not concern them. There is a war in the south, the new family says, a war between two lords who both claim the same piece of land. There is a plague in the east, a sickness that kills quickly, that turns the skin black and causes the body to swell and stink. There is a new king on the throne, a young man who promises to be strong and just, though the new family does not know his name or remember the name of the old king. The peasants listen and they nod and they return to their work because the war is far away and the plague is far away and the king is far away, and the only things that are close are the field and the cow and the roof that needs mending and the children who need feeding. But the plague is not far away for long. It travels along the roads, carried by travelers and merchants and soldiers, moving from village to village, from town to town, leaving behind it a trail of death that is unlike anything the peasants have ever seen. The plague arrives in the village on a summer day, brought by a peddler who stops at the inn to sell his wares. The peddler looks tired, his face flushed, his eyes bright with fever. He drinks a cup of ale, pays his coin, and continues on his way. 3 days later, the innkeeper's wife falls ill, her body covered in black swellings, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The wise woman comes with her herbs, but the herbs do nothing, and the innkeeper's wife dies, and then the innkeeper dies, and then the children die, and then the neighbors die, and within a month, half the village is dead, and the survivors are too weak to bury them. The peasant watches his family die one by one. His mother goes first, old and frail, her body unable to fight the fever. Then his youngest child, the one who still slept in the bed with the mother, a small body that turned black and swelled and stopped breathing in the night. Then his wife, the woman who had shared his bed and his work and his silence for 20 years, her face peaceful in death in a way it had never been in life. The peasant does not weep because weeping requires a kind of energy that he does not have, and because the tears would not bring them back, and because there is no one left to see the tears. He digs the graves himself, one after another, the shovel heavy in his hands, the earth hard and dry. He buries his family in the churchyard, in a row of new graves that are too close together, and he says the words that the priest would have said if the priest were not dead, and he walks back to the empty house, and he sits by the cold hearth, and he does not move for a long time. The village after the plague is a different place. Half the houses are empty, their doors standing open, their thatch beginning to rot. The fields are untended, the weeds growing tall, the grain left to fall and rot on the ground. The animals have wandered off or been eaten by wolves, and the wolves are bolder now, coming closer to the village, their howls echoing through the empty streets at night. The survivors are few, and they are changed, their faces marked by grief and hunger and the strange, hollow look of people who have seen something that cannot be unseen. They work, but the work is harder now because there are fewer hands to do it, because the fields are larger than the people who remain, because the future is uncertain in a way it never was before, when the patterns were fixed and the cycles were predictable and death came in its proper time, in the winter among the old and the very young. The peasant survives. He does not know why. He was not stronger than the others or younger or healthier. He was simply lucky or unlucky depending on how one looks at it. He works the fields alone, his back bent, his hands raw, his eyes fixed on the ground. He eats alone, sitting by the fire in the house that is too large for one person, the silence pressing on him like a weight. He sleeps alone, the bed cold beside him, the pillow empty. He does not speak to anyone because there is no one to speak to, and because the words have become heavy, too heavy to lift from the throat and push past the lips. He works and he eats and he sleeps and he waits, though he does not know what he is waiting for. The winter comes, and the peasant is not prepared. The fields produced less grain than usual because the work was done by too few hands, because the weeds were not pulled, because the rain came at the wrong time and the sun at the wrong time, because everything was wrong. The peasant's store of grain is small, and the winter is long, and the hunger returns, sharper than before, more desperate. The peasant eats the last of the bread, and then the last of the pottage, and then the last of the dried beans, and then there is nothing. He looks at the cow, which has grown thin and weak, and he knows that he will have to kill her, that her meat will keep him alive for a few more weeks, that her hide will keep him warm, that her bones will make a broth that will taste of nothing but will fill the stomach. He kills the cow with a knife, not because he wants to but because there is no choice, and he butchers her in the byre, the blood running into the straw, the smell of death mixing with the smell of the manure, and he takes the meat into the house and hangs it from the rafters, and he eats a piece of it raw because the fire is low and he is too tired to cook. The days pass and the peasant grows weaker. The meat does not last as long as he hoped, and the hunger returns, and the peasant begins to eat things that are not food. The leather of his shoes, boiled until it is soft. The bark of the trees outside the door, stripped and chewed. The bones of the cow, cracked open and sucked for the last traces of marrow. His body shrinks, the skin hanging loose on his frame, the eyes sinking into the sockets. He does not leave the house anymore because the effort is too great, because the cold is too bitter, because there is nowhere to go. He sits by the fire, feeding it the last of the wood, the last of the furniture, the last of the wooden bowls that had been in his family for generations. The fire burns, and the peasant watches it, and the hours pass, and the days pass, and the winter continues. And then the spring comes, and the peasant is still alive, though barely. The snow melts and the streams swell, and the first green shoots appear in the fields, and the peasant crawls outside, his hands digging in the soil, pulling up the roots of the weeds, eating them raw, the dirt still clinging to them. He finds a bird's nest and eats the eggs, shells and all. He finds a dead rabbit, frozen since the winter, and he thaws it by the fire and eats it, the meat stringy and tasteless but welcome. He survives, and the survival is not a triumph but a continuation. A simple refusal to stop breathing, a stubborn clinging to a life that has become a burden. He does not know why he continues, only that the body continues, that the heart beats, that the lungs fill, that the sun rises and sets and the seasons turn and the world does not stop just because one man's family is dead and his fields are empty and his house is cold. The village repopulates slowly over the years. New families arrive, drawn by the empty houses and the abandoned fields, by the promise of land that costs nothing, by the desperate hope that the plague will not return. The peasant watches them come, and he watches them build their houses and plow their fields and have their children, and he feels nothing or almost nothing, a faint echo of the feelings he once had, a memory of grief and love and fear that is like the memory of a dream, fading with each waking hour. He works alongside the new families, not as a leader or a teacher but as a presence, an old man with a bent back and a quiet voice, a survivor of a time that the new families cannot imagine and do not want to imagine. He does not tell them about his wife or his children or the plague or the winter when he ate his own shoes. He keeps those things inside, where they belong, in the dark place where the memories go when they are too heavy to carry and too precious to throw away. The peasant dies, finally, on a summer evening, in the house that was his parents' house and his grandparents' house, in the bed where his children were born and his wife died, with the fire burning low and the window open to let in the warm air. He is not old, not by modern standards, but his body is worn out, the joints swollen, the lungs rattling, the heart irregular and weak. The new families do not know his age, and he does not know it himself because no one kept track, because the years blurred together into a single long season of work and hunger and loss. He lies in the bed, and the woman from the house next door sits with him, holding his hand, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth. She is not his daughter because his daughter is dead, but she is kind, and she has learned kindness from her own mother, who learned it from her mother, and the kindness is real even if it is not attached to love. The priest comes, a young man who was not in the village during the plague, who knows the old peasant only as a face in the congregation, a silent presence at the back of the church. The priest speaks the words of the last rites, the Latin flowing over the peasant like water over a stone, the meaning lost but the intention clear. The peasant receives the bread, and the bread is the body of Christ, and the body of Christ enters the peasant's body, and for a moment the peasant feels something that might be peace or might be simply the absence of pain, the stillness that comes before the final stillness. He closes his eyes, and the woman from the next house holds his hand, and the priest prays, and the fire crackles, and the evening light slants through the window, and the peasant's breathing slows and stops, and there is nothing, and the nothing is not frightening, is not anything, is just the end of the breath and the end of the heart and the end of the thoughts that had filled the mind for so many years, thoughts of the field and the cow and the children and the bread, all of them fading now, all of them dissolving into the silence, and the silence is complete, and the silence is the same silence that was there before the peasant was born, the same silence that will be there after the last person has died and the last house has fallen and the last field has returned to forest, the silence that is not waiting and not listening and not caring, the silence that simply is. The woman from the next house closes the peasant's eyes and folds his hands on his chest and covers his face with a cloth. She calls the men of the village to dig the grave, and they dig it in the churchyard among the other graves, the old ones and the new ones, the marked ones and the unmarked ones. The priest says the words and the bell rings, and the peasants carry the body to the grave, and they lower it into the hole, and they throw the earth back in, the sound of the earth hitting the wood, the sound of the shovels scraping the ground, the sound of the priest's voice fading into the afternoon air. The peasants stand for a moment, and then they turn and walk back to the village, and the work continues because the work does not stop for death, because the field needs weeding and the cow needs milking and the children need feeding, because the world is full of tasks that must be done, and the dead are dead and the living are alive, and the difference between the two is simply the difference between movement and stillness, between breath and the absence of breath, between the fire that burns and the fire that has gone out. The grave settles over time, the earth sinking, the grass growing, the wooden cross leaning and rotting and falling. The name of the peasant is forgotten, the memory of his face fading from the minds of the few who had known him, and then those minds are gone as well, and the peasant is nothing, not a name, not a face, not a story, just a body in the ground, just bones that will turn to dust, just dust that will mix with the soil, just soil that will grow the grass, that will be eaten by the sheep, that will be sheared for the wool, that will be woven into the cloth, that will be worn by someone who does not know, who cannot know, who will never know that the ground beneath their feet was once a person, was once a life, was once a long and slow and steady repetition of the same small tasks, the same small hungers, the same small hopes, the same small defeats. The night is very dark now, the hour very late, the world very quiet. The fire in the hearth of the imagination has burned down to a few red embers, and the embers are fading, and the darkness is growing, and the silence is deepening. The listener lies in the darkness, the blankets warm, the pillow soft, the body still. The breath slows and the thoughts drift, and the boundaries between the self and the world become thin and permeable, like the walls of a medieval house, letting in the cold and the smell of the earth and the distant sound of the animals stirring in their sleep. There is no need to hold on to anything, no need to remember any of this, no need to understand or analyze or conclude. The words have done their work or they have not, and either way, the night continues and the darkness continues and the silence continues and the listener continues, not as a listener anymore but as a sleeper, not as a self but as a presence, a small warmth in a large darkness, a breath among the other breaths, a heart beating in the great stillness, a life being lived in the only way it can be lived, moment by moment, breath by breath, beat by beat, until the moments run out and the breaths stop and the beats cease, and the darkness that follows is the same darkness that was there before, the same darkness that is there now, the same darkness that will always be there, waiting, patient, silent, complete.